Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to oped.tv. The Black church has always been a sanctuary, a refuge, a safe place for people who often had nowhere else to turn. Tragically, it has also been a favorite target of violence for people consumed by hate. Throughout our history, churches have been burned and bombed, and defenseless worshipers have been murdered in cold blood. And so it was again when a young man armed with a .45 caliber weapon shot and killed 9 people who were attending a Bible study service at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Among the dead was the pastor, the Reverend Clementa Pinckney. Why has the Black church been such a target for violence? Why is this still going on well into the 21st century? And what does this latest tragedy tell us about the state of race relations today? We'll discuss all of this with my guest, Walter Fields, the executive editor of NorthstarNews.com. He has spent most of his adult life studying and chronicling the great challenges facing America's Black population. Walter, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
Talk a bit about the history of the Black church, going back to the very early days, and why has the Black church been not just important, but crucial to the lives of African Americans?
Sure. The Black church grew out of the abolitionist movement, American slavery. So you had the formation of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, Richard Allen out of Philadelphia, James Varick out of New York, forming the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Both of those denominations, Methodist denominations, grew out of a resistance by white Methodists to include blacks in their worship service. So you had African Americans only 20 years after American independence and literally 80 years before the formal end of slavery, forming their own religious denominations, basically out of being excluded out of the worship practice of these white Methodist denominations. The Black church has always been sort of the citadel of opportunity for African Americans. It was a place where blacks could meet and talk freely. It was a place where leadership could be developed within its walls. It was a place where African Americans could be educated at a time when blacks weren't even allowed to read. So the Black church has always been central to the Black liberation struggle. And that's why it's no coincidence that this shooter showed up at a Black church. He could have showed up anywhere, right. And he chose a Black church. The Black church through the civil rights movement was central to that movement. When you look at the Black church and the Black Baptist church, people forget that Dr. King and people like the late Reverend Dr. Gardner Taylor, they actually split from a Black Baptist denomination because they wanted to be involved in social justice issues. So you had young Black pastors in the early 1960s who actually split away from the National Baptist Convention, which was the premier Black Baptist association, and formed the Progressive Baptist Association because Dr. King and others felt as though the church had to remain true to its history. It had to be involved in the struggle for justice for African Americans. So the Black church has always been central to this issue of Black liberation. It's been the triad of Black institutions. You had the Black church, you had historically Black colleges and universities, and you had Black banks.
Right.
The 3 most important institutions to the African American community.
If you look back through history, you see that they, not just community leaders, not just protest leaders, but even political leaders came out of the Black church. Can you talk about the idea that I would assume that this leadership emerged through the church because, in large part, there were so few opportunities elsewhere. So you talk about that a little bit.
There were few opportunities elsewhere, and it was sort of a safe haven, so to speak. And when you had people like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, they were all members of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Bishop Alexander Walters, one of the founders of the NAACP, and someone who even President Woodrow Wilson was trying to name an ambassador to Liberia, grew out of the Black church experience. That leadership developed because there was no other institutions, with the exception of Black colleges, which were just in their formation. The Black church was the place where African Americans could go and to develop those leadership skills and those organizing skills beyond the purposes of religious practice, because the Black church wasn't formed as just a religious institution. Certainly that was central to its core, but it was also the place that African Americans could come and determine their fate, determine their future. So you saw this leadership develop out of the black church through the years, and it became the place where you could go to. It's the reason why people always ask, well, how come, black ministers are always at the forefront of these movements? Right. Well, there's a history behind it. It's not by coincidence. And it continues today sort of in a different way. But the black church has been central to the development of black leadership, and not just pastors. We're talking lay people who have come out of the black church. Right. And use that church as the foundation for leadership.
Now, we had this horrible attack in South Carolina, and people remember, even if they're quite young, from history, the fact that the 4 little girls were killed in Birmingham, Alabama, in the bombing in 1963. But the truth is, there has been a long, unbroken history of violent attacks against the black church. They don't get a lot of attention. They're not well covered. Talk a little bit about what has happened and why that happens.
Well, through the years, the black church has always been a target for extremists, whether it's through bombings or churches being burned down or assassination attempts, simply because it was such an easy target. If there was any place, particularly in those southern communities, where extremists knew that they could attack the leadership of the black community, it was that church. And so it was also a place that used for intimidation purposes, that extremists understood that there was no safe haven outside of that church building. So if we attack the church and those inside, and there is a long history of church burnings in our country. There's a long history of lynchings related to leadership that was church related. So when we look at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in 1963, the murder of 4 little girls, and we now fast forward to 2015, and what we saw in Charleston, it's a continual pattern of intimidation against the African American community using the black church as a target. There are only so many institutions that you can literally go to that are independently owned, that are controlled by African Americans, and that develops leadership. The church is one of them, so it's an easy target.
It was made clear, one of the great tragic ironies of this attack in Charleston, about how open and welcoming Emmanuel AME Church was. I mean, this fellow was invited in and actually attended a Bible study session for an hour before the killings took place. And that just seems to be part of it. The churches, the fact that they are so open and such a cornerstone of the community makes them actually so vulnerable. And I guess my real question is there any alternative to that? Because you don't want to start setting up metal detectors at churches, and you don't really want armed guards walking around churches. What can be done about this?
Really, nothing can be done. I mean, that's the irony of this horrific crime. People forget that Dr. King's mother was killed in a church.
People, I have mentioned that recently, and nobody that I've mentioned it to
they can't remember that she was shot playing the organ in Ebenezer Baptist Church.
But she was shot by a black man.
By a black man, yeah. But she was still shot.
Exactly, in church.
In church, because they are open, they're accessible. The irony of this latest tragedy, as you mentioned, is that this killer sat among these members of the church during Bible study before he committed this act. And I think if you talk to any black pastor in America, the last thing that they want is for there to be armed guards at the door or metal detectors, because it really contradicts the whole notion of faith and confidence in a higher being. And so this tragedy, I think, for black pastors, they have to put it in context as to their mission and service to the larger community. And it's a hard call, because you look at this crime and you immediately want to react. And perhaps the best reaction is what we see happening right now, that you see this movement building up that we haven't seen in 30 years, a movement around social justice. So in many ways, these 9 are once again martyrs, like the 4 little girls were in that church in Birmingham.
One of the things that surprised me in the wake of these killings in Charleston is the swiftness of the turnaround on the issue of the Confederate battle flag, which flies on the grounds of the State House in South Carolina. People that you would not have expected to call for that flag to be taken down are now lining up and saying, you know, the time has come. Did that surprise you, and why do you think that's been happening?
I think it's a measurement of progress. In 1963, when those 4 little girls were killed, there was no talk about removing Confederate symbols, no talk about removing names from buildings honoring people, connected to the Confederacy. Fast forward to 2015, we have a different nation now. And even those who may have supported the flying of the Confederate flag under issues of, cultural importance to the South, have come around because the reaction to this crime, it was so repulsive. And because we're living in a digital age, so many people bore witness to what happened in Charleston that I think the reaction was such that people now who have long stood on the side of the flag should still be flown, even a governor of South Carolina came out with a very strong statement. The state newspaper in South Carolina came out with an editorial opposing the flying of the flag. This is where we have to say we've made some progress in America. Even though it's a reaction to a very heinous crime, you have to realize that's progress.
The race issue is always so complicated. So for a long time, we were making tremendous progress. If you go back to the civil rights movement and then say up to maybe the end of the 20th century or into the 1990s, whatever, definitely tremendous progress made. This is a different country from when I was a young man. On the other hand, it has seemed in recent years that maybe we were sliding backwards, including, a rollback in the Voting Rights Act and that sort of thing. Nevertheless, you're mentioning that now there seems to be some momentum. Where do we stand in terms of race relations today? How good or bad are we in terms of what kind of shape we're in?
If I had to grade it on an academic scale, I would probably say we're at a C-.
Okay.
We've made progress without a doubt, but we've also slipped in some areas simply because I don't think we've been as vigilant as we should have been in making sure that progress continued. The other thing I like to remind people is that this nation hasn't even celebrated its 250th birthday. We're really still in our infancy.
It's still a young country.
It's still a young country. If you compare us to other nations, we're a baby, we're an infant. And we've made unbelievable progress in that time. And when you look at African Americans being brought here as Africans enslaved, and you see an African American in the White House, it says something about the progress. But even with that progress, you have to measure it now, I think, by institutional measurements. There are institutional barriers now in America that have to be confronted. And I think once those institutional barriers are confronted, you will see another period of rapid progress and change. This is the next big fight in this country.
You mentioned Barack Obama, and this is another example of how difficult these issues can become. So he's the first African-American president, swept, well over 90% of the black vote, not surprisingly, in this country. But he's had a great deal of difficulty talking about the race issue. And he really is in a tough spot. On the one hand, he's damned if he talks too much about it or if he talks too clearly or plainly or candidly about it. On the other hand, he's damned if he tries to avoid the topic. How well do you think he's negotiated this really treacherous terrain?
Not well at all. But I think this week he found himself. Mm-hmm. I think when he, for the first time, connected racism and slavery and their history, I think he did what he was trying to do in that Philadelphia speech. Mm-hmm. It finally
came Philadelphia speech during the first campaign.
Mm-hmm. It finally came together for him because I think it's personal. He knows the pastor, and I think it's a personal loss for this president. And I think it finally came together. But I think the real value of the Obama presidency was that it was meant to show us how much more work we have to do. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have looked at it and said, well, he hasn't said enough about race and racism, or maybe he's saying too much. I think history will show that the real purpose of this presidency was to put our country into a social context, to say, this is who we really are. We think we've made progress, but we're going to see through this presidency how much more we have to do. And I think you see how sort of it's almost an alignment of the stars right now. He's coming to the end of his terms. You have this horrific crime. You've got a presidential election coming up. Now you have all presidential candidates focused on issues of race and social justice like they've never been in any recent presidential campaign, including Obama's two campaigns.
I agree, and I would venture to say that none of them really wanted to be dealing with
no, the Democrat or Republican.
Exactly,
Nobody wanted
right.
to deal with this. Now they're being compelled to. So sometimes there is a reason for things happening.
Right. The obviously, the killings in South Carolina is an obviously terrible tragedy. But beyond that, can you talk a little bit about the ways in which racism and racial discrimination remain serious problems in this country?
Sure. Well, you look at education. There have been a lot of reports over the last 2 years about racial disparities in education, where black children are being suspended and expelled from school disproportionately than their white peers who are committing similar offenses.
Right.
We see the disparities in access to these advanced courses, advanced placement courses that now all colleges say are necessary for students to be college ready. You see wide disparities in what students are allowed into these classes. You see it in the private sector. We still have rampant employment discrimination in the private sector.
Such an important issue which doesn't get talked about much at all.
About at all. In fact, you wouldn't even know the EEOC exists because you never hear about cases being brought against private sector employers. That's a huge issue because when you begin to look at the disparity in who gains access to white-collar jobs, who gains access to the trajectory of a career that allows them to have a real economic livelihood, it's not happening for African Americans. This recession decimated the black labor market.
The black community is still in a recession.
Yes, without a doubt. If you look at labor market statistics, don't look at unemployment. Look at long-term joblessness.
Right.
The black community has not recovered.
Nope.
And so when you look at those issues, you begin to understand that institutionally, if you look at criminal justice, the fact that almost every month we're hearing about cases of individuals being released who were wrongly imprisoned, people spending 30 years behind bars. It's the institutional bias, the institutional barriers that are the next great frontier in this country. We've improved greatly on individual social relations. I mean, you have nut jobs out there, you have extremists. Right. I'm 56. I know things have improved in terms of personal relationships between blacks and white in America. What hasn't changed are the institutional barriers. We are now heading towards a day when people of color are going to be the majority. The question is, what is that country going to look like?
Right. One of the ways in which we have gone backwards is in voting rights. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, the voting rights issue is obscene. When you think about the progress we made in this country, when you think about
and the effort that had to
that went into
that progress.
I mean, if you look at Selma, if you look at the struggle over the Voting Rights Act, if you look at the court cases, Baker versus Carr, if you look at all that history, and now realize what's being done in individual states, the imposition of voter ID laws, which are nothing more than bringing us back to the days where you had a literacy test, to vote. When you look at redistricting and how legislative districts are being carved up purposely to minimize black voting power and Latino voting power. Very difficult to overcome. So when you look at these efforts, you begin to realize that the only reason why we made progress is because we took a quantum leap in getting blacks elected to Congress, putting blacks in city hall and state legislatures, and even on courts where you have elections. That's being rolled back. So now what we have, and if you look at the federal judiciary, we're literally at the place where there is one circuit in the federal judiciary, the Ninth Circuit, that is considered to be sort of a safe haven to test these cases.
How did you feel personally when the Supreme Court rolled back some of those key provisions of the Voting Rights Act?
For me personally, it was very hurtful. My great-great-grandfather was a Civil War veteran, fought in the Union Army, a North Carolina slave. I still have my great-grandmother's poll tax receipt from North Carolina. I know the impediments that were put in place to restrict blacks from voting. So to see this done in my adult life in 2015 does not make me feel good about the direction in which we're heading as a country. And it makes me think about my own daughter, who is 16. And I was hoping that she would not have to see the type of challenges and battles that I saw as a youth as a child in the 1960s and 1970s, but unfortunately, she will, because this landscape has to be changed.
Right. Now, poll after poll, and our own experience as well, shows us that in general, whites and blacks view most of these race issues very differently, whether it has to do with the extent of racism or discrimination or police procedures, or whether it even has to do with how well the races are getting along. There's a real divide there. What accounts for that divide? Is it simply the different experiences people have, or is it deeper and more complex than that?
I think it's two things. I think it's our history, which is embedded in our DNA, which we can't easily change. And I think it's the context of the existence of blacks and whites in America. You know, the idea for whites that there is somehow this inequity, this imbalance that still exists. And so when you talk about the historical connection, slavery, Reconstruction, civil rights movement, many whites just have a difficult time from where they sit understanding that. Right. And so I think it's a contextual issue with blacks and whites in America, but it's also buttressed by our deep history, which we've never really accounted for in a very truthful way.
Right. One of the things that has caught the attention of a lot of people in the wake of the South Carolina shootings was that hearing, I guess it was a bail hearing for the accused killer, where so many members of the family said that they forgave this young man. And it made big headlines all over the country, all over television, and that sort of thing. So that was a big story. I had the impression that that conveyed sort of the wrong impression, because it kind of suggested that the black community in general was in a forgiving mood, which is different from what I was hearing among people I was talking to. What's been your reaction? What I was seeing was a great deal of anger. Mm-hmm. What's been your reaction relative to forgiveness on the one hand and anger on the other?
I think the forgiveness is not necessarily for the perpetrator of the crime. I think for these families, the act of forgiving helps them.
I agree.
That it's an empowering thing, that you can stand there and face this killer and say, I forgive you. I don't think people understand. If you talk to folks from the civil rights movement who have family members killed, if you talk to the King family, I remember one of my conversations with Mrs. King was this notion of, at some point, you can't carry that baggage.
Right.
You can't carry that anger because it destroys you.
Right.
And I think for these families, what they did in forgiving this killer was basically saying, we're not going to allow this hate to destroy us as a family. And what happened in South Africa when they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I sat in on some of those hearings, they could have easily taken a different path in South Africa.
Right.
But I think the leaders of South Africa understood that by doing this, we are going to free ourselves from this hate that we've carried for so long for these people who have done these awful things to us, because we can't move forward as a country if we don't do this.
Tell me how you got into this idea of civil rights and racial justice and that sort of thing as your life's work.
As an elementary school student who was watching the civil rights movement unfold, who wrote to President Johnson as a third grader and got a response. And I actually I retrieved those letters this year from the Johnson Presidential Library. They had my letters that I wrote to the president as an elementary school student. So for me and my family history and what I was seeing in my own local community.
Which was where?
Hackensack, New Jersey.
Right.
A good family friend was the first black to serve on the presidential staff in the White House. So for me, it was just part of who I am. And I've stayed that course.
Well, we're glad that you did. We've run out of time. I wish we had more time. Walter Fields, thank you so much for being with us. Right. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. In the wake of the massacre of 9 African Americans in a racially motivated shooting at a church in Charleston, South Carolina, people are again asking what should be done with the Confederate battle flag, not just in South Carolina, but everywhere. I'll give you the short answer: bury it. There should be no place for that racist, treasonous, terrorist flag anywhere in the United States of America. The Confederate flag, in all of its nefarious manifestations, was the banner of people who violently revolted against this country. It's a symbol of oppression, cherished by those who enslaved the people of my race and who continue to terrorize black people to the present day. It's the flag around which the Ku Klux Klan loved to rally. It's the flag of white supremacy. I view the Confederate flag the same way I view the Nazi swastika, with the highest possible degree of revulsion and contempt. There's a reason why the person responsible for the slaughter of those worshipers in South Carolina had previously been flaunting the Confederate flag and desecrating the American flag. He knew all too well what the Confederate flag stands for. That's all for now. See you next time.